Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the lives of children in medieval Europe, when survival was uncertain, and the weight of mortality pressed upon even the smallest among us. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honour, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. I remember well the silence that followed the cry of a newborn, for in those days no one knew if that fragile spark of life would endure the first winter. In villages across Europe, families often buried more children than they raised, and the weight of grief lay heavy in every household. Half of all little ones never saw their 5th year, their names whispered only briefly before being carried away by time. Such loss was not a rare misfortune, but a constant presence woven into the rhythm of medieval existence. Disease spared no family, and its grip reached into every cradle. Smallpox scarred young faces, measles swept through cottages, and dysentery struck without warning after a single drink of foul water. Few homes escaped the sting of mourning, and funerals became as common as baptisms. In my travels, I often saw mothers with hollow eyes, their arms empty, yet still rocking as if memory alone could soothe what was gone. The land itself seemed accustomed to loss, and so were we who lived upon it. Those who survived bore witness to the frailty of their beginnings. I recall young men who carried the stiffness of old ailments, their bodies weakened by fevers from childhood. Girls often entered womanhood already diminished by years of hunger and sickness. To see a youth grow strong was to see something close to a miracle. Even priests preached that life itself was a narrow path between death's constant snares, and that survival was proof of God's mercy. The shadow of mortality was as close as one's breath. It is difficult for modern hearts to grasp how death lived in the same room as birth. Infants were laid beside their parents on straw pallets, and it was not unusual for one child to be replaced by another within the same year. Families grieved, yes, but they also hardened themselves, for too much mourning would cripple the living. Parents loved, yet often with guarded hearts, knowing the grave might soon steal what the cradle had given. This was not coldness, but the only armor against despair. In towns, bells tolled ceaselessly, sometimes for markets, sometimes for plague, but often for the youngest dead. Guild records note apprenticeships cut short by sudden fevers, while parish books filled with the names of those baptized and buried in the same week. Every document of those centuries echoes with the fragility of beginnings. It was said that to live beyond childhood was to have survived a battlefield, fought with no sword in hand, only the frailty of flesh. I've walked past churchyards where tiny graves outnumbered those of grown men, each marked by a wooden cross soon worn away by weather. The earth became heavy with children who never learned to speak their first full prayers. Some mothers carried tokens of their lost little ones, locks of hair tied with thread, as though such relics might tether memory to the world. These mementos were silent testaments that love endured even where life could not. What shaped us most was the expectation of loss. Parents often bore many children, not only from desire but necessity, knowing that only some would reach maturity. Entire lineages might be extinguished within a single outbreak, leaving farms abandoned and bloodlines broken. Kings and peasants alike trembled under this truth. No rank shielded one from the reach of early death. Even heirs to thrones were buried before their crowns could be placed, shifting the course of dynasties. And so I look back upon that time knowing that childhood was never a safe season, but a battlefield of its own. To survive was to emerge scarred, to carry the memory of siblings lost, and to walk with the knowledge that every breath was precarious. This constant confrontation with mortality shaped the very soul of medieval Europe, hardening some hearts while deepening the compassion of others. It was a world where love was fierce because life was fleeting, There was little space in our world for the tender idea of innocence. A child who could stand was expected to carry a jug, herd a goose, or tend to a fire. The notion that youth should be shielded and nurtured was foreign to us, for survival demanded that even the smallest hands contribute. Medieval eyes did not see a separate stage of life, but only a smaller body learning the labours of its elders. Childhood, as you know it now, was a luxury that few even imagined. In paintings of the age, children often appear as miniature men and women, clothed in garments identical to their parents. Their round faces bore the solemn expressions of adulthood, for the artist did not regard them as creatures of play, but as figures destined to shoulder the same burdens. Manuscripts, too, record children not in terms of growth or learning, but in terms of labour owed and duties fulfilled. It is striking how little space was given to the softness of youth in the imagination of our time. Fathers measured sons not by affection, but by how quickly they could lift a tool or swing a flail in the field. Mothers guided daughters into kitchens and spinning rooms, preparing them for the inevitability of early marriage. It was rare for a child to be spoken of as fragile or precious, for too often life itself proved otherwise. Love existed, yes, but it was wrapped in the cloak of expectation, for idleness could not be afforded. To be young was to be trained in endurance from the first steps. Even in noble households, where privilege softened some blows, children bore the weight of preparation for their roles. A boy of high birth was dressed in miniature armour and taught the bow or the sword before his limbs had strength enough to endure the lessons. A girl of lineage learned manners, embroidery, and household management, for she would soon carry the honour of her family in marriage. What we now might call play was often nothing more than rehearsal for the adult life to come. The Church reinforced this view by stressing obedience and moral discipline from the earliest years. A child was not seen as a vessel of innocence, but as a soul in need of correction, a sinner from birth to be guided firmly. Priests urged parents to raise their offspring in the fear of God, not in indulgence. Thus, discipline, both spiritual and physical, was considered an act of love, for the path to salvation was thought to be narrow and filled with snares. Childhood was moulded under stern hands and sharper words. Literary works of the Middle Ages seldom paused to describe the joys of growing up. Chronicles mention children mainly when they inherit lands, marry, or die. The stories that filled the halls of castles and taverns alike centered on heroes, saints, and rulers, not on the small lives that flickered briefly before adulthood. When children did appear in tales, they often symbolized purity, lost, or responsibility gained, not the fleeting season of curiosity and wonder. Silence, in this sense, tells as much as words. Their existence was acknowledged, but rarely celebrated. Still, within these harsh views, I sometimes glimpse tenderness. A mother humming to soothe her infant, a father guiding a son's hand upon a plough with patience rather than scorn. These moments were not absent, but they were not regarded as the defining essence of youth. They were private comforts, not cultural ideals. Publicly, a child's worth was measured in service, in strength, in readiness for the burdens to come. Softness remained hidden behind closed doors, if it could survive at all. Thus the medieval world marched forward with little recognition of what you call childhood. We, who lived it, seldom reflected upon it as a distinct season, for the days rushed quickly from cradle to duty. Only centuries later would men begin to write of children as beings to be nurtured, protected, and cherished for their own sake. For us, they were simply the next generation of labourers, warriors, and wives, stepping early onto the same road already worn by their elders. The beginning of life was fraught with peril, for the act of childbirth was among the most dangerous trials faced by women and infants alike. Without physicians trained in the sciences you know today, most births rested in the hands of midwives, whose wisdom came from experience rather than learned texts. Yet even their practiced hands could not always ease complications. and the risk of death for mother and child lingered heavily over every labor. Villages were accustomed to the sound of weeping that followed what should have been the joyous cry of life. In many homes, baptism was rushed with urgency, sometimes within mere hours of birth. Families feared that a newborn might perish before receiving the sacrament, condemning the child's soul to limbo according to the teachings of the Church. Priests were summoned even in the night, traveling through mud or snow to bless water and speak the words of salvation. For parents, this ritual was more than faith. It was a desperate safeguard against eternal loss. Few moments carried such weight in the medieval heart as the swift christening of a fragile infant. The ceremony itself was simple but solemn. The priest traced the sign of the cross upon the child's brow, poured water over its head, and named it within the community of believers. Godparents, often chosen with care, pledged to guide the soul through the trials of Christian life. To bear such a role was not a token duty, but a real responsibility, binding families together in webs of faith and obligation. Even the poorest peasants sought to fulfill this sacred act, for to die unbaptized was considered a fate too fearful to accept. Records from parish registers show how swiftly some baptisms were followed by burials. A name was entered into the book of the living, and almost at once copied into the book of the dead. In some cases, the priest baptized infants still at their mother's breast, who drew only a few weak breaths before slipping away. Such sorrow hardened hearts, yet it also made faith indispensable. Parents believed they had at least secured the eternal rest of their children, even if their bodies could not endure the trials of earthly life. Midwives carried knowledge passed through generations, often blending Christian rituals with older folk practices. They whispered prayers, tied charms, or used herbs to ease pain, though their remedies were often powerless against hemorrhage or fever. Some were accused of witchcraft when births went poorly, for desperation often sought someone to blame. Yet without these women, countless more lives would have been lost, for they stood as guardians in the most fragile passage of human existence. Their role was both revered and feared, suspended between trust and suspicion. The nobility faced the same uncertainties, despite their wealth. Queens and noble ladies frequently died in childbed, altering the course of kingdoms. A single failed birth could end a dynasty or throw succession into turmoil. Chronicles recall the grief of kings who lost heirs before they could even walk, reminding us that mortality respected no crown. The cradle of a prince was as uncertain as that of a peasant's child, proving that birth itself was the great equalizer in our world. I recall seeing mothers cradle their newborns with eyes both joyful and haunted, as if love itself carried danger. They cherished the moment, but feared to hope too strongly, lest fate strike them down. Baptism was the only shield they could raise against the vast unknown, and so it was clung to with urgency. Faith gave them strength to embrace what reason could not explain. The child's first journey was not into play or discovery, but into the arms of the Church, whose blessing was thought to be life's first necessity. Thus birth, instead of a simple beginning, was a crossing filled with shadows. From the first breath, the infant's life was uncertain, and the baptismal font became the true cradle, securing a place in heaven should the earthly struggle be too brief. For those of us who lived in those times, it was impossible to separate birth from the awareness of death, or to hold a child without sensing both love and fear in the same embrace. Bread was the heart of our sustenance, yet even that staple was uncertain. In years when harvests failed, loaves grew smaller, darker, and harder, stretched with peas, beans, or ground acorns to make flour last. The poor chewed bread that broke teeth, while the wealthy could afford whiter wheaten loaves, soft and rare. For children, such differences meant the strength to endure winter or the weakness that drew them closer to the grave. Food was never only nourishment, it was survival itself. The diet of peasants was meagre, heavy with grains and thin pottage, a broth often boiled from cabbage, onions, and whatever scraps remained. Meat seldom reached the mouths of children outside feast days, and fish was only for those near rivers or seas. Milk soured quickly, yet butter and cheese offered small comfort when available. Hunger gnawed at little bodies, stunting growth and leaving them more vulnerable to sickness. The youngest often carried the marks of deprivation in their bones and faces. When famine struck, as it did in the years of the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317, children were the first to suffer. Chroniclers spoke of villages where little ones starved quietly, while adults strained to survive on bark, roots, or boiled nettles. It was not cruelty, but the harsh logic of survival that led families to feed those strong enough to labor, leaving the weakest to fade. Hunger during those years was more relentless than any sword upon the battlefield. The wealthy, too, faced shortages, though never with the same desperation. Even noble children sometimes saw their tables diminished when poor harvests spread scarcity across whole regions. Yet their households could still purchase food from afar, while peasants had no such reach. This divide between rich and poor was sharpened most cruelly in the stomachs of children, whose empty bellies marked the line between privilege and suffering. To grow up with enough bread was itself a blessing. Malnutrition did not merely bring frailty, it opened the door to illness. Without proper nourishment, the body lacked the strength to resist fevers, coughs, and the many plagues that haunted our time. A child weakened by hunger was like a candle flickering in a storm, quick to be extinguished. In villages, entire groups of children might vanish after a bad harvest, not by the sword, but by the slow, unrelenting erosion of life. Hunger was a silent killer, less visible than war, yet just as deadly. Even in ordinary years, meals were repetitive and plain. Children ate the same pottage day after day, sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt if fortune allowed. Ale, weak, and often brewed at home, replaced water, which carried disease, and thus even the young drank it from their earliest days. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare and often consumed only in season. What seems a simple apple to you was in those days a fleeting gift, not to be taken for granted. The memory of hunger shaped the character of those who survived. Many adults carried a fear of famine throughout their lives, storing what little they could and valuing food above all else. Children raised in scarcity learned thrift and endurance, yet they also bore scars of frailty that could not be undone. Their bodies told the story of their youth, thin shoulders and bent frames reflecting a lifetime of shortage. Every meal was counted, every bite measured against the chance of tomorrow. And so hunger walked beside childhood as a constant companion. To be born in medieval Europe was to enter a world where the harvest governed destiny and where the lack of nourishment shaped not only the body but the soul. For children, the promise of life was often weighed down by the emptiness of their stomachs, a reminder that even the most innocent were not spared the cruelties of the earth. Illness lingered everywhere in those days, unseen yet ever near. Children coughed in smoky cottages, their small bodies racked with whooping fits that stole the breath from their lungs. Dysentery spread quickly through contaminated water, leaving little ones too weak to rise from their straw bedding. Scarlet fever painted their cheeks with fire, only to consume them with chills soon after. Few families escaped untouched by these common afflictions, and the loss was carried in silence, because words could not lessen the weight of absence. The crowded streets of towns bred sickness faster than fields could yield grain. Waste flowed into rivers from which children drank, and lice crawled beneath their garments, spreading fever and infection. Public baths, when they still existed, were no safeguard, for the very water carried contagion. Mothers prayed over infants while physicians, bound more to tradition than science, prescribed herbs or bloodletting that rarely brought relief. In such a world, to survive the ordinary fevers of youth was a triumph as great as any knight's victory. When the Black Death came in the mid-14th century, it struck children with equal ferocity. I recall hearing of villages where no young voices were left, where churchyards filled with tiny graves until the earth itself could hold no more. Parents buried sons and daughters in haste, often without proper rites, for fear of contagion and the speed with which death advanced. Those who survived bore haunted eyes, for they had seen not only their companions fall, but the very fabric of their communities unravel. Records tell of households where every child perished while adults lingered on, broken by grief. In towns, schools closed and workshops fell silent as the youngest disappeared. Even noble families wept, for plague spared neither castle nor hut. The sudden absence of children in a generation left gaps that would shape the decades to follow, creating echoes of loss in every corner of society. It was said that laughter itself became rare, for the voices that once carried it had been stilled. The fear of epidemics changed how children were regarded. Some parents clung tighter, fearful of losing what they cherished, while others hardened their hearts, wary of giving too much love to lives so easily taken. Priests called these trials a test of faith, urging acceptance of God's will, even as graveyards filled beyond their walls. Superstition thrived in the wake of despair, with whispers of curses, poisoned wells, or divine punishment. For the young, these fears became a shadow they could not understand, but always felt. Even lesser outbreaks of measles or pox could leave marks that lasted a lifetime. Survivors carried scars across their faces or suffered weakened limbs that limited their strength. Yet they counted themselves fortunate, for survival itself was a rare mercy. I often think of how children bore such burdens silently, without choice or complaint, growing into adulthood, already marked by the frailty of their earliest years. Their endurance was as much a part of medieval life as the ringing of the church bell. Care for the sick rested largely upon mothers and sisters, who watched helplessly as remedies failed. Monasteries sometimes offered herbs and shelter, yet even there disease crept behind cloistered walls. Physicians wrote treatises filled with humours and balances, but their words seldom matched results. For children, the best defence was simply strength of body, which many lacked due to hunger and hardship. Thus, illness cut deeper into the young, for their defences were fragile against the forces that beset them. Thus, the memory of childhood in that age cannot be told without the shadow of disease. From fevers that burned through villages to plagues that swept away nations, the young bore the heaviest toll. Their brief lives remind us how precarious existence once was, where every cough might be the herald of loss and every embrace might be the last. To be a child, then, was to live always in the presence of sickness, a constant companion no one could escape. In times of hunger and despair, some parents faced choices so terrible that words scarcely capture their weight. When famine struck or poverty crushed a household, infants were sometimes left at crossroads, church porches, or riverbanks, their cries fading into silence. Such acts were not always born of cruelty, but of desperation, when survival for the family seemed impossible with another mouth to feed. Though condemned by the church, the reality persisted, leaving countless small lives unrecorded, except in the grief of those who bore them. Church doors often became the last refuge for the abandoned. Infants were left wrapped in cloth upon stone steps, entrusted to God's mercy and the charity of others. In later centuries, foundling hospitals arose in cities like Florence and Paris, offering at least a chance of survival. Yet, the journey from doorstep to safety was perilous, and many never reached the protection intended for them. Records speak of infants found lifeless, chilled by the night, or carried off before they could be saved. Infanticide, though forbidden, was whispered of in villages where famine pressed hardest. Some mothers, fearing condemnation, hid their acts beneath silence, while chroniclers noted cases where the law intervened with harsh punishment. These tragedies reveal the crushing weight poverty placed upon the most vulnerable, forcing choices no heart should bear. In fields and forests, remnants of such deeds lingered, stories told in hushed voices by those who feared to admit what hunger could drive one to. The church thundered against these acts, proclaiming them sins of the darkest kind. yet priests also urged compassion, knowing the burdens borne by the poor. Almsgiving was promoted as a Christian duty, not only to feed the hungry, but to save the innocent from such fates. Confraternities and monasteries sometimes took in children, raising them as servants or novices, but the number they could save was a drop against the tide of need. Faith offered guidance, though it could not erase the harshness of the world. Among the nobility, abandonment was rare, yet unwanted children born of scandal or illegitimacy were sometimes quietly set aside. Noble families feared dishonor as much as poverty, and the infants of hidden liaisons were often sent away or left to institutions. Even among wealth, children were not always secure in their place. Reputation and inheritance weighed heavier than compassion in such cases, and silence concealed much that would never be spoken aloud in courtly halls. I recall hearing confessions where mothers wept for the children they could not raise, their voices cracked by sorrow. Their choices haunted them, yet their plight was understood by neighbors who faced similar desperation. In those days, survival carved mercy into strange shapes, and what might appear monstrous was often the product of unbearable necessity. Communities judged, yet they also recognized the cruel hand of fate that forced such actions. Grief clung to these stories long after the lives themselves had ended. The survival of abandoned infants who did find care was uncertain. Many were placed as servants or apprentices as soon as they could walk, their childhood shortened into labor. Others entered monasteries as oblates, their lives given wholly to prayer and discipline. Though they had escaped the peril of the streets, their paths remained marked by the hardship of their beginnings. Few knew the comfort of being truly wanted, yet they endured, as children often did, with a resilience that astonishes the heart. Thus, the story of abandonment and infanticide reveals the cruelest face of medieval life. It was not the absence of love, but the scarcity of bread that drove such acts, a reminder that desperation can strip even the most sacred bonds. To be born into that world was to face chance itself, where survival depended as much on fortune as on family. In the quiet of night, I still recall the weight of such sorrows, heavy as stone upon the soul. In the homes of our time, obedience was carved deep into the fabric of daily life. Children were expected to submit to their elders without hesitation, for disobedience was seen not merely as mischief, but as sin. The teachings of Scripture, often repeated by priests, declared that sparing the rod would spoil the child, and many parents took these words as divine instruction. Discipline was thought to shape both the soul and the body, forging endurance for the hardships that lay ahead. Few questioned this order, for it was the custom of all. Fathers often carried the authority of judge within their households. A disobedient son might be struck with a belt or a stick, not out of malice, but with the conviction that pain taught better than words. Mothers too enforced strict correction, particularly upon daughters whose behavior reflected the family's honor. Public shame was another tool. A child caught in lies or laziness might be mocked before neighbors or scolded in front of the parish. To humiliate was to teach, and to teach was to save from worse failings later. The boundary between discipline and cruelty was thin, and it varied from home to home. Some parents wielded punishment with heavy hands, leaving bruises and silence in their wake. Others balanced sternness with gentleness, speaking after the blows to remind the child of love behind the lesson. Yet even tenderness was often hidden, for open indulgence was feared to breed weakness. Children thus grew accustomed to correction that mingled with affection, though the harsher side lingered longer in memory. Schools, where they existed, reinforced this same severity. Monastic teachers kept rods at hand, and boys who stumbled in their Latin prayers often felt them across their backs. Some chroniclers recall children trembling before their masters, not for the difficulty of learning, but for the punishment that followed mistakes. Discipline was seen as the very foundation of instruction, without which knowledge would not take root. The lash was thus as much a part of education as parchment and ink. It is easy now to imagine cruelty. Yet for us, correction was bound tightly to survival. A child who failed to obey could endanger the household, whether by letting animals stray, wasting food, or neglecting tasks. In such a precarious world, mistakes carried heavier costs than today, and so the correction of errors was often swift and severe. Children who learned discipline early were thought better prepared for the hardships of adulthood, where obedience to lords, guilds, or the church was expected without question. Even within noble halls, severity reigned. Young squires were struck by their masters for slowness or disrespect, their training as much about discipline as about skill in arms. Daughters of nobility were corrected for breaches of etiquette, for their future as wives demanded flawless comportment. Servants, often children themselves, endured harsher punishment still, for they had no kin to shield them. Authority flowed downward, and at every rung of society, the young bore the brunt of its weight. Yet not all memories of discipline are bitter. Some recall the lessons learned through stern correction as the very tools that preserved them. A son who feared his father's wrath might later thank him for the strictness that kept him alive in harsher company. A daughter who endured sharp words learned caution that spared her from scandal. Such reflections remind us that discipline was not always cruelty, but often a distorted form of care, rooted in fear of a world that punished weakness without mercy. Thus, childhood was shaped by a rhythm of correction, where pain, shame, and obedience walked hand in hand. The rod was seen not as a weapon, but as a guide, harsh, yet necessary in the eyes of those who wielded it. To grow up in such a household was to learn that love and severity were bound together, inseparable as day and night. Though we may question it now, in that age, discipline was considered the surest path towards survival and salvation alike. Life in the village left little room for idleness, and even the smallest feet were quickly set to work. Once a child could stand without tumbling, tasks were given, light at first, but constant. Fetching water in clay jugs, gathering twigs for the hearth, or shooing chickens from gardens became the early lessons of responsibility. There was no thought of waiting until adolescence to shoulder duties. The rhythm of survival demanded every hand. The laughter of youth was often drowned by the clatter of daily labor. Water was perhaps the most common burden. Children carried it from wells or streams, balancing heavy buckets against their small frames. The path was long and uneven, and many stumbled, spilling what had taken such effort to draw. Yet even in tears, they learned persistence, for the task would be repeated each day. Firewood too filled their arms, bundles of sticks gathered from hedges and forests, essential to keep warmth in homes where winter pressed hard. Such chores taught endurance before they had the strength to call it by name. In the fields, young ones served as watchful guardians. They herded geese, sheep, or pigs, keeping them from straying into neighbors' crops. A careless moment could bring punishment, for animals were wealth, and their loss meant hunger. Some children clapped wooden clappers, or shouted through fields to chase away birds, protecting grain from being devoured before harvest. The task was simple, yet vital, reminding even the youngest that the fortunes of the household rested partly in their hands. Daughters were often drawn into the work of the household itself. From dawn, they learned to spin wool, mend garments, and stir pots of thick pottage. Mothers passed down knowledge through repetition, showing little girls how to weave, knead bread, and care for younger siblings. Boys, too, might tend fires or carry supplies, though their training soon bent toward the heavier tasks of ploughing and craft. Each child was a mirror of their parents' labours, shaped early into the mould they were expected to fill. In towns, tasks shifted but did not ease. Children swept market stalls, fetched goods for masters, or tended animals tethered at inns. Apprenticeship awaited many, but before that formal step, they already tasted the discipline of work. Errands ran endlessly through narrow streets, small bodies darting between carts and merchants. Leisure was scarce, for coin was hard to earn, and every effort of a child contributed to the survival of the family. The city's clamour was their school, its demands their first lessons. The church looked upon labour as a duty aligned with divine order. Priests preached that idleness was the devil's playground, warning parents not to indulge their children in laziness. Thus, chores were not only economic necessity, but spiritual safeguard. To work was to serve both household and God, and to shirk duty was to invite sin. Even children scarcely able to comprehend such words felt their weight, for sermons echoed at home, where parents enforced the same truth with sternness. Amid such constant tasks, moments of play were fleeting and often tied to work itself. A child chasing geese might laugh as they scattered, or one hauling wood might turn it into a game of strength against a sibling. Yet these sparks of joy were woven into necessity, not separated from it. Life left little space for idle diversion, and what modern hearts call childhood games were then fragments of relief carved into labour's demands. The line between work and play was thin, if it existed at all. Thus, to grow up in those days was to grow into toil from the moment one could walk. Each step carried responsibility. Each gesture served a purpose for the household's survival. Childhood was measured in tasks, not in years, and the measure of a child was how well they carried burdens. In that ceaseless rhythm of chores, the young learned resilience, though often at the cost of the carefree wonder that belongs to youth. By the age of 7, many boys were sent away from their homes, their childhood cut short by the demands of trade. Families who could not feed all their children often placed them under the care of a master craftsman, binding them by oath and contract. These apprenticeships promised skill and livelihood, yet they also stripped children of familiarity and comfort. To leave the warmth of one's family hearth for the cold order of a workshop was a turning point that marked the end of youth. The life of an apprentice was strict and unyielding. Days began before dawn, often with cleaning the shop or tending the fires that fueled the craft. Tasks were menial at first, fetching water, carrying tools, sweeping floors, but punishment awaited any failure or delay. As years passed, children learned the trade itself, whether blacksmithing, weaving, carpentry, or baking. Masters demanded perfection, and harsh words or blows were considered part of the teaching. The craft was hard, but harder still was the discipline that shaped the child into a servant of skill. Long hours were the unspoken law of apprenticeship. 12, sometimes 14 hours of labour left little time for rest or leisure. Meals were modest, shared at the master's table, though often the apprentice received less than the family. Sleep came in corners or lofts, away from the comforts of home. In this life, affection was rare, for the bond was built not on nurture, but on obligation. The child endured because there was no alternative. To rebel was to risk being cast out with nothing. In towns and cities, guilds oversaw these arrangements, setting rules for training and conduct. Guild records show that apprentices were bound for years, some until the age of 21, before they could claim the title of journeyman. While the system gave order and opportunity, it also confined the young to long servitude. Many never reached the end of their contract, lost to illness, accident, or escape. Yet for those who endured, apprenticeship was the gateway to survival, a path that might one day bring respect and independence. Girls too sometimes entered apprenticeships, though their roles were often tied to weaving, spinning, or service in households. Their labour was just as demanding, with long days bent over looms or tending kitchens. Abuse was not uncommon, for they were vulnerable in households where they held no power. Still, some learned valuable skills, finding places within guilds or carrying knowledge back to their villages. The burden was heavy, but for some, it provided the means to endure in a society that left few options for the poor. Violence and cruelty were frequent companions in this training. Masters believed that strictness instilled strength, and apprentices were often beaten for mistakes or disobedience. Some bore scars from their years of service, both upon the body and the soul. Others found in their suffering a hardening that prepared them for the trials of adulthood. Discipline was regarded as the foundation of skill, and so the rod was as present in the workshop as the tools of the craft itself. Despite the severity, apprenticeship also brought the hope of mastery. Children who endured could rise in status, gaining the right to earn their own wages and one day open shops of their own. Guilds offered fraternity, a place within the fabric of urban life, and the possibility of escape from peasant toil. For many, this was the only path upward, though it came at the price of childhood itself. Opportunity and suffering walked side by side, inseparable in the life of the apprentice. Thus the training of the young was forged in hardship. To be bound under a master was to surrender freedom, endure harsh discipline, and learn resilience in the face of endless demands. For some, it ended in ruin. For others, it became the foundation of a future craft. Yet all shared the truth that medieval childhood was brief, for by 7 years of age, the burdens of adulthood were already laid firmly upon their shoulders. Among the nobility, the burdens placed upon children were different in shape, but not in weight. From the moment of birth, noble sons and daughters were heirs not only to land and privilege, but also to duties that stretched far beyond their years. Their lives were measured against the expectations of lineage, and their every gesture reflected upon the honor of the house. What appeared to others as comfort was in truth a cage of responsibility, gilded yet inescapable. Childhood for nobles was not freedom, but preparation. Boys born to noble families were set early upon the path of knighthood. At 7 or 8 years of age, they were sent as pages into the households of greater lords. There, they learned courtesy, the handling of weapons, the care of horses, and the arts of service. Their days were long and regimented, filled with lessons in both obedience and valor. The laughter of youth was replaced by the clang of practice swords and the stern voice of tutors drilling them in discipline. The training did not soften with time. By adolescence, these boys became squires, serving knights directly in battlefields and tournaments. They polished armor, held lances, and stood close enough to war to taste its dust and fear, even before wielding a blade in earnest. The life of a noble son was thus steeped in blood and duty, demanding courage long before manhood arrived. Few had the chance to hesitate. The weight of their future pressed too heavily upon them. Girls of noble blood bore their own obligations, equally demanding though of a different kind. From early years, they were schooled in piety, embroidery, music, and the management of a household. They were taught to maintain dignity, for they would one day represent their family in alliances forged by marriage. Some were promised to suitors while still in their early teens, their unions sealed not by affection, but by politics. To wed at 12 or 14 was not uncommon, and in that moment, youth ended. These early marriages were not mere formalities. They bound dynasties, secured land, and built power. A girl's body became the vessel of her family's legacy, and her ability to bear heirs was valued above all else. The weight of expectation was immense, and many young brides entered households of strangers, separated from their kin. Love was seldom part of these arrangements, and duty alone guided their steps. Even in castles, children were rarely permitted the freedom of choosing their own paths. Noble education reached beyond household and arms. Sons were instructed in Latin, heraldry, and the laws of inheritance, while daughters absorbed the traditions of courtly behavior. Tutors and clerics ensured they could recite scripture and maintain the appearance of virtue. Failure in these lessons carried consequences not only for the child, but for the entire lineage. Nobility, in this sense, did not lessen burdens. It magnified them, binding children to destinies they could not refuse. For those who succeeded, the rewards were considerable: influence, power, and a place in the chronicles of kingdoms. Yet such rewards came only after years of submission, training, and the sacrifice of youth. The noble child was less a son or daughter than a vessel of ambition, shaped to serve the will of the family. Though the halls they walked were rich, the weight upon their shoulders was often heavier than that borne by the poorest peasant child. Thus, even within castles, the innocence of childhood was fleeting. Nobility offered no escape from duty, only a different form of hardship cloaked in silks and titles. The young of noble blood grew quickly into roles that demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and endurance. What the world saw as privilege was, to those who lived it, the steady loss of freedom from the earliest years. The gift of learning was scarce in the centuries I walked, reserved for a narrow slice of society. Most children, especially in villages, grew into adulthood without ever holding a quill or tracing letters upon parchment. To read and write was a privilege, not a right, confined to monasteries, cathedral schools, and noble households. Knowledge itself was guarded like treasure, and those who possessed it were seen as set apart from the common world. For the vast majority, words remained distant, like stars too high to touch. Monasteries stood as the heart of education, where boys offered as oblates or chosen for clerical paths, studied beneath the eyes of monks. Their days echoed with chants of psalms and the labour of copying scripture by hand. Latin was the language of instruction, the key to sacred texts and scholarly discourse. Children bent their backs over wooden desks in cold stone rooms, scratching ink onto vellum with painstaking care. These halls produced the rare few who would preserve the wisdom of the age, while outside them, silence reigned. Cathedral schools, often tied to great churches, offered education to a slightly broader circle, though still few in number. Sons of merchants or officials might be admitted, trained in grammar, rhetoric, and arithmetic. Yet such opportunity required wealth or connections, leaving most beyond the threshold. The lessons were harsh, carried out under the threat of the rod, for discipline was considered essential to learning. Still, for those who endured, these schools opened the door to clerical or administrative positions, rare paths of advancement in a rigid world. For girls, the road to learning was narrower still. A handful of noble daughters learned to read scripture, often guided by mothers or governesses within the home. Some convents taught writing and psalmody, though few extended instruction beyond religious devotion. Women such as Hildegard of Bingen or Heloise stand as exceptions, remembered precisely because their education was so rare. The majority of girls, even among nobility, were trained not in letters, but in the skills of household and marriage. Peasant children remained outside these realms altogether. Their education lay in fields, stables, and kitchens, where survival offered its own lessons. They learned to sow, reap, mend, and barter, but seldom to read a prayer or count beyond their fingers. Oral tradition carried their knowledge, with tales, proverbs, and songs shaping their understanding of the world. Though illiteracy limited them, it did not strip them of wisdom, for their lives demanded other forms of skill. Still, the written word remained a barrier they could not cross. Books themselves were rare treasures, copied by hand and bound at great cost. A single volume might take months to produce, its pages illuminated with careful strokes of ink and colour. Few ever held such objects, and fewer still could interpret their contents. For a child to learn from such a book was itself a sign of status, a mark that set them apart from nearly all their peers. Knowledge carried weight, and those who held it wielded power beyond the strength of arms. The Church's dominance ensured that education was tied to faith. To learn to read was to learn scripture, to write was to copy sacred words, to count was to measure tithes. Secular knowledge existed, medicine, law, philosophy, but it remained secondary, often filtered through religious authority. Thus, a child who entered the halls of learning was shaped as much by theology as by grammar. The mind was molded not only for service to knowledge, but for obedience to faith. In those days, learning was not seen as a universal right, but as a privilege bestowed upon the few. For most children, life passed without letters, their knowledge carved from earth and toil, rather than ink and parchment. Yet the memory of those small circles of study lingers, for they preserved what might otherwise have been lost. In the silence of the villages, children labored. In the quiet of monasteries, children wrote, and thus the fragile thread of knowledge endured across centuries. The narrow streets of medieval towns rang with the sounds of children at work. From early morning until night, young boys and girls filled markets, workshops, and alleyways, their small bodies bent to tasks that demanded far more than their years. Unlike the countryside, where chores were tied to fields and animals, urban life pressed children into service for merchants, craftsmen, and innkeepers. Their work was not seen as exploitation, but as necessity, for survival in towns required every member of a family to contribute. Markets were among the busiest places for the young. I recall boys carrying baskets brimming with bread, fish, or cloth, weaving between crowds of traders. Girls fetched water from fountains, scrubbed stalls, and stood at their parents' sides, learning to bargain with sharp words and quick eyes. The air was thick with shouting and smells, spices, tallow, dung, and children grew up amid this clamour, shaped by commerce as much as by their families. The marketplace was their classroom, though its lessons were often harsh. Workshops swallowed many others, where apprenticeships blurred into long days of unpaid labour. Children fanned forges in smithies, wound spindles in weaving rooms, and mixed mortar on building sites. Their fingers grew calloused before they were grown, and their backs bent early under loads too heavy for them. A child's mistake was not overlooked, for wasted materials meant lost profit. Masters treated their youthful helpers with sternness, expecting them to match the pace of adults long before they were ready. The poorest knew no master's protection at all. Street children begged on corners, offering songs or small services in exchange for scraps of food. Others scavenged through refuse heaps for anything of value, bones to sell, cloth to mend, or wood for kindling. Some turned to theft, snatching purses or fruit from distracted vendors, only to face brutal punishment if caught. These orphans and runaways were among the most vulnerable, left to navigate a city's cruelty with no family to shield them. Inns and taverns relied heavily on youthful labour. Boys stabled horses, carried ale, and cleaned filthy floors, while girls scrubbed pots and served guests under the gaze of strangers. Their work brought them into contact with all manner of travellers, pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, exposing them to the dangers of urban vice as well as opportunity. Many endured scolding, beatings, and even worse, yet they bore it in silence, for employment meant food and a place to sleep when the streets offered nothing. The law rarely protected such children. Town authorities focused on trade and order, not on safeguarding the young. If a child was injured or mistreated, little recourse existed beyond the mercy of a master or the pity of a passerby. Guilds set some boundaries for apprentices, yet enforcement was inconsistent. The harsh truth was that the city valued labour more than the well-being of those who provided it, especially when they were small enough to be overlooked. Despite the burdens, children learned resilience in these settings. They picked up the rhythms of trade, the craft of bargaining, the skills of artisanship, and the habits of endurance. Some who survived the gauntlet of youth rose to secure positions within guilds or households, their difficult beginnings shaping a sharper cunning. Yet for many, the city consumed them, their lives cut short by disease, injury, or poverty. The promise of opportunity was always shadowed by peril. Thus, the towns of medieval Europe offered children neither refuge nor freedom, only work pressed upon them with relentless weight. Their laughter echoed rarely, swallowed by the din of commerce and the demands of survival. In every corner of the city, from market to workshop to tavern, childhood was measured not in play, but in labour. For those who walked those streets, the memory of youth was written in aching limbs and calloused hands, rather than in carefree joy. In countless households, children toiled not as sons or daughters, but as servants bound by duty or debt. Families too poor to sustain every mouth often gave a child to wealthier neighbours, hoping service might provide shelter and food. Yet this arrangement rarely spared them hardship, for their days were filled with ceaseless tasks: scrubbing floors, tending fires, carrying water, and caring for livestock. Though they were young, they carried the responsibilities of adults, often with little kindness shown in return. The wealthier the household, the greater the demands. In manor kitchens, children rose before dawn to grind grain, stir pots, and wash heavy wooden trenchers slick with grease. They fetched wood for vast hearths, ran errands across courtyards, and endured sharp words from cooks and stewards. At table, they stood silently, ready to pour ale or clear platters at a master's command. Such labour taught them discipline, but left them weary, with little time for their own lives beyond service. Some of these young servants were orphans or abandoned infants taken in by charity, yet their gratitude did not shield them from exploitation. Others were sold outright, their labour exchanged for coin or favour, blurring the line between service and slavery. In towns, poorer children often became household drudges for merchants and artisans, filling every menial role. Though not bound in chains, they were bound by poverty, unable to leave without risking starvation. Their lives were tethered to the authority of their masters. For girls, the burdens were especially heavy. Many were sent into kitchens and laundries, scrubbing linens, baking bread, or spinning wool for hours without pause. Others were nursemaids, caring for children scarcely younger than themselves. Vulnerability often placed them at the mercy of masters or guests, and abuse was a silent shadow that few dared to speak of. Service was both their survival and their prison, offering sustenance but denying safety. Childhood was swallowed by duty long before womanhood arrived. Even noble households, with their halls draped in banners and silks, relied upon young servants. Boys ran messages through castle corridors, polished armour, and tended to stables, while girls carried trays in great feasts or wove in spinning rooms. They witnessed splendour, yet never shared in it, their presence invisible except when summoned to act. Service in such places could teach refinement, yet it reinforced the truth that children of humble birth existed to labour for the comfort of others. The Church spoke of the virtue of humility and obedience, teaching that to serve faithfully was pleasing to God. Priests urged masters to show mercy, yet often their words fell short against the weight of custom. For those in service, faith was both solace and chain, comfort in prayer, but also justification for endurance. A child might whisper psalms in the quiet of night, seeking strength for another day of toil. Religion eased suffering, but it rarely removed it. Some children endured years of service and eventually earned small wages or a place within a guild. A few rose in station, carrying skills learned in households into their own futures. Yet many remained bound in servitude, their youth consumed by endless chores, their hopes diminished by the constancy of labour. Even when freedom came, they bore scars of weariness and submission, lessons etched too deeply to be easily cast aside. Their paths were marked by the shadows of the homes they had served. Thus, service defined the lives of countless medieval children, shaping them with obedience and weariness in equal measure. It was a world where the innocence of youth was exchanged for survival, where young hands laboured for the comfort of others, while their own needs went unmet. The line between servant and slave was often too thin to see, leaving many children trapped in lives they had never chosen. Their silence echoes still, reminding us how little protection youth afforded in that age. Few aspects of our age spared the young, and war least of all. Raids, feuds, and campaigns swept across fields and villages, leaving homes burned and families broken. Children fled with their mothers into forests or hid among barns, listening to the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. When they emerged, it was often to ruins, their world reduced to ashes and silence. Innocence was fragile in such times, for conflict stole it as surely as hunger or disease. Orphans were countless in regions scarred by battle. Chronicles tell of wars in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire where children wandered alone, their parents slain, or taken. Many fell into servitude, seized by victors or sold in markets far from their homes. Others were forced into labor for armies, carrying water, tending horses, or scavenging wood for fires. They lived at the edges of war, too small to fight yet close enough to feel its sharpest edges. Boys destined for arms entered the turmoil early. By the age of 12, some already served as squires, following knights into camps where the stench of blood and smoke became their schooling. They learned to polish mail, carry lances, and tend to wounds, standing close enough to battles to witness horrors that would haunt them forever. War offered them no shield for their youth, only the expectation that they would one day step into the fray themselves. Girls endured violence in other forms, often suffering during raids or as spoils of conquest. Chroniclers seldom wrote of them, yet their silence speaks volumes of what was endured. Families sought to protect daughters by hiding them or sending them to convents, yet safety was never certain when armies marched. Fear became a constant companion, shaping the lives of the young long before they could speak of it. War, indifferent to gender, carved wounds into all. Even those who survived without capture or death carried scars of memory. I have seen children flinch at the sound of hooves, their eyes wide with recollection of fire and steel. Others grew hardened, their play imitating battles they had seen, their games marked by the echo of violence. In this way, war seeped into their very imagination, shaping not only their present, but the generations to come. The legacy of conflict lingered in the hearts of the smallest witnesses. The church urged knights to spare the innocent, yet war seldom obeyed sermons. Laws of chivalry proclaimed protection for women and children, but in the fury of conquest, such vows were forgotten. Castles fell, villages burned, and the youngest suffered without recourse. Those who spoke of mercy were rare. Those who practiced it, rarer still. For children, war was not glory, but terror, a relentless force that stripped away the fragile shelter of family and home. Some children followed armies willingly, drawn by necessity or the promise of bread. They became camp followers, carrying supplies, cooking, or running errands. Yet these roles exposed them to constant peril, for battles could scatter or consume them in an instant. Their lives were shaped by movement, uncertainty, and the relentless presence of violence. They belonged neither fully to war nor to peace, drifting in a space where both claimed them. So it was that the youngest were never far from warfare's reach. Castles, fields, towns, all bore witness to their suffering, their laughter muted by fear and loss. Childhood in such an age was a fragile thing, too easily broken by the march of armies. In the shadow of conflict, the young learned early what it meant to endure, though the price was innocence surrendered before its time. In our world, the path to adulthood was often marked not by years, but by marriage, and this burden fell early upon the young. Girls as young as 12 and boys at 14 could be joined in unions sanctioned by canon law. These bonds were seldom born of affection. They were alliances forged to bind families, secure lands, or settle disputes. A child scarcely free from the games of youth might suddenly find herself a wife, or himself a husband, expected to carry responsibilities beyond their strength. Among the nobility, these unions were instruments of power. Daughters were bartered as tokens in negotiations, their futures decided long before they could speak their wishes. Sons inherited the weight of dynastic continuity, betrothed to extend lineage and strengthen ties. A wedding might seal peace between rival houses or secure a kingdom's succession. Behind the fine garments and churchly blessings, however, were children unready for the roles imposed upon them, their own desires silenced by duty. Peasant families, though less bound by politics, also wedded their children early when poverty demanded it. A marriage could bring a dowry, an extra pair of hands, or the promise of alliance with another household. The union was practical above all, a means of survival rather than a celebration of love. Girls often entered homes of strangers, bearing the weight of service to new in-laws. while boys suddenly carried the role of providers with little preparation. The strain upon youth was immense, yet it was accepted as the way of life. For noble daughters, the demands did not end with marriage vows. They were expected to bear heirs swiftly, often while still in the fragile years of adolescence. Many young brides suffered in childbirth, their bodies unprepared for the dangers it brought. Mortality in childbed was a constant spectre, turning what should have been new beginnings into tragic ends. The burden of securing family lines fell upon their shoulders, a task that consumed many before they reached full womanhood. Even for boys, early marriage was no gentle path. Though celebrated as men, they were still youths, thrust into roles of authority over households they barely knew how to manage. Apprenticeship or military service might still be ahead, yet they were already bound to provide for wives and future children. The weight of expectation pressed them into adulthood before they could grow into it. Their laughter dimmed beneath the solemn responsibilities of headship and survival. The church recognized such unions as sacred, blessing them in chapels and under vaulted roofs. Priests proclaimed that marriage was both duty and sacrament, binding souls before God. Yet behind the sanctity lay the reality of pressure, silence, and fear. Children stood at altars repeating vows they scarcely understood, their lives redirected by the will of parents and lords. The holiness of the rite offered no shield against the hardships it concealed. Some endured these arrangements with quiet resilience, finding companionship over time where none existed at first. Others lived in bitterness, bound to lives chosen for them, their hopes dimmed by the weight of expectation. Chronicles record both unions that blossomed into partnership and those that collapsed into cruelty or neglect. What remained constant was that the choice rarely lay in the hands of the young. Their futures were determined long before they could shape them. Thus, marriage in our age was not the culmination of love, but the imposition of duty. Childhood ended swiftly at the altar, its innocence surrendered in exchange for alliances, survival, or power. The young bore the burden without protest, for it was the custom of the time, yet behind the rituals lay sorrow, as often as joy. To live under such bonds was to carry responsibilities too great for tender shoulders, yet they carried them because they had no choice. Loss of parents was a fate that touched countless children, for disease, famine, and war left many without shelter or kin. The death of a father could mean ruin, for he was often the household's provider, while the loss of a mother left infants in peril, unable to survive without her care. In such times, orphans wandered streets or fields, relying on the charity of neighbors or the mercy of strangers. Their lives were fragile threads, easily broken by hunger or neglect. Monasteries sometimes opened their doors to these lost souls. A child might be taken in, clothed in simple garments, and set to menial tasks in return for food and safety. While they escaped starvation, their days were austere, filled with prayer, labor, and silence. Charity in such places was given with conditions, and though it spared life, it seldom softened it. The monastery raised servants of God, not children free to play or dream. Yet for many, it was the only refuge from the streets. Confraternities and guilds in towns also stepped forward, forming brotherhoods that provided aid to abandoned youth. Some built hospitals and almshouses where infants could be left rather than cast into the cold. These institutions, though limited in number, became lifelines for the desperate. Still, resources were scarce, and survival rates remained grim. The children who did endure often grew into the very systems that once saved them, becoming servants, laborers, or members of the church. Charity was not always born of compassion alone. It was also tied to faith and the promise of salvation. Giving alms, feeding orphans, or sponsoring their care was seen as a path to forgiveness of sins. Wealthy patrons funded foundling homes in hope of heavenly reward as much as earthly kindness. Thus, the fate of orphans was bound to the spiritual economy of the Middle Ages. their survival intertwined with the quest of others for eternal grace. Those who could not find places in such institutions often fell into harsher fates. Town streets filled with children, begging, stealing, or offering labor for scraps. Vulnerable and unprotected, many were exploited, pressed into servitude or worse. Some disappeared into households where their voices were silenced, their existence barely recorded. Chroniclers seldom dwelled on their lives, yet their presence haunted every corner of medieval towns, shadows of innocence lost to hardship. Among the peasantry, neighbors sometimes took in orphaned children, though this was often an act of survival rather than pure charity. A boy might be useful in fields, a girl in kitchens, and so they were absorbed into new families, less as children than as workers. While some found warmth in these arrangements, many felt the sting of being outsiders, forever marked by the loss of their true kin. Their place in such households was uncertain, secured only by their usefulness. Despite the grimness, bonds of care did sometimes blossom. Godparents were called upon to step into guardianship, fulfilling promises made at baptism. In rare cases, orphans were treated as kin, raised with affection that defied the cold logic of survival. These exceptions remind us that compassion, though rare and strained, did survive amid hardship. It flickered like a candle against the wind, fragile yet real enough to leave traces in memory and record. The story of orphans in those centuries is one of endurance against overwhelming odds. Institutions, monasteries, and neighbors offered fragments of help, yet nothing could replace the love and safety of lost parents. Childhood in such circumstances became a struggle to be seen, to belong, to survive another day. Their lives stand as quiet testimony to the resilience of the young, who bore burdens no child should carry, yet carried them because the world left no other path. To be born outside the bonds of marriage was to carry a mark that lingered for life. Illegitimate children, though innocent of their birth, were often treated as lesser beings, their rights curtailed and their futures clouded by stigma. Inheritance laws denied them claims to land or titles, leaving them vulnerable to poverty even when their fathers were men of standing. The church condemned fornication, and so the children born of it bore the weight of their parents' sin in the eyes of society. In villages, such children were whispered about, their mothers judged with harsh tongues. Some were abandoned at birth, for shame pressed as heavily as hunger. Others were raised within households, but always with a shadow over their place. Neighbors might sneer, calling them bastards, a word that carried both insult and exclusion. Their lives were shaped not only by hardship, but by the constant reminder that they were different, their worth questioned by the very communities that sustained them. Noble bastards faced a peculiar fate. Though often denied inheritance, they could still wield influence if acknowledged by their fathers. Many kings kept such children near, granting them lands, marriages, or military commands. William the Conqueror himself was illegitimate, a fact that colored his life, yet did not prevent his rise. Still, these were exceptions. For most, illegitimacy was a barrier that blocked paths to power. Legitimacy defined lineage, and lineage defined destiny. For girls, the burden was heavier still. An illegitimate daughter carried her mother's shame in a way sons did not, and her marriage prospects were often limited. Some were sent to convents, cloistered away where scandal could be contained. Others entered service in wealthier households, their low status fixed regardless of their abilities. Their futures depended less on their character than on the stain of their birth, a weight that silenced many hopes before they could take root. The church sometimes intervened, granting legitimacy through special dispensation if parents later wed. Such acts could restore a child's rights, though they required wealth or influence to secure. In poorer families, this hope was rare, leaving most children to grow in the margins of law and faith. Baptism gave them entry into the Christian fold, yet it did not erase the social mark. They walked in two worlds, accepted as souls before God, but judged as flawed by their fellows. In cities, illegitimate children often swelled the ranks of servants, apprentices, or beggars. Lacking inheritance, they relied solely on labor to carve a place in society. Some found patrons or guilds willing to accept them, but many were left adrift, vulnerable to exploitation. Their position was precarious, and survival required resilience greater than that of their legitimate peers. The streets knew their names, but the law often refused them standing. Despite the scorn, bonds of affection endured. Many mothers raised their children with fierce devotion, shielding them against gossip and poverty as best they could. Some fathers, though unable to grant them full rights, offered support or protection quietly, balancing duty with discretion. In these moments, humanity broke through the harshness of custom, proving that love could defy the dictates of law. Yet such mercy depended on circumstance, and countless children never knew it. The fate of the illegitimate reminds us of how society clung to rigid notions of order and purity. Childhood in such cases was lived under a shadow, shaped by forces beyond a child's control. Their struggles exposed the cruelty of a world that judged birth as harshly as deeds, condemning many before they could even begin their lives. Yet they also reveal resilience, for some rose despite scorn, leaving their mark upon history, even while carrying the scars of rejection. The lives of children in my age were often tangled with superstition, for the unseen world was believed to press closely upon us. Illnesses and misfortune were rarely explained by nature alone, but by whispers of spirits, curses, or the devil's hand. Children, fragile and voiceless, were sometimes thought to attract such forces. A sickly child might be judged as cursed, their weakness seen not as hunger or disease, but as evidence of evil hovering near. Fear turned innocence into burden. Among the most haunting beliefs was the notion of changelings. Some thought that fairies or demons had stolen a healthy child and left a weak, strange one in its place. Families who clung to this superstition might neglect or mistreat the afflicted, hoping to drive the imposter spirit away. Folklore told of placing such children near fire, in cold, or in peril to force the true child's return. These cruel acts, born of ignorance, often cost lives already fragile from sickness. Signs and omens were read into the behavior of the young. A child who cried endlessly might be thought to foretell death in the household. One born with a birthmark or deformity could be whispered about as a harbinger of misfortune. Mothers prayed fervently, crossing themselves over cradles, hanging charms, or sprinkling holy water in fear of unseen forces. In truth, their desperation was less about malice than about the terror of living in a world where survival felt forever uncertain. The Church condemned such folk beliefs, yet could not erase them. Priests urged parents to trust in God's will, offering blessings and sacraments, yet even they sometimes mingled faith with superstition. Holy relics were pressed into children's hands, saints' names invoked in prayers against sickness or sorrow. Between official doctrine and village custom, the line blurred, and families lived within both. Fear shaped their choices, drawing from faith and folklore alike in search of comfort. Superstition also shaped how children were disciplined. A lazy child might be accused of being bewitched, beaten not only for disobedience, but to drive out imagined spirits. Nightmares were thought to be visits from demons, and children were made to sleep with charms or crosses above their beds. To stumble, to stutter, to falter. These small weaknesses were often interpreted as signs of darker interference. The burden of such beliefs pressed hard upon those least able to defend themselves. In times of plague or famine, the weight of superstition grew heavier still. Communities desperate for answers sometimes turned suspicion toward children, believing their presence brought calamity. Though rarely recorded in chronicles, such fears simmered in villages, shaping how the vulnerable were treated. Innocence could not shield the young from the suspicion of desperate minds. When reason faltered, fear took its place, and children bore its cruelty. Yet there were also gentler forms of belief, meant to protect rather than harm. Mothers tied amulets around infants' necks, stitched charms into garments, or whispered protective words while rocking them to sleep. Families taught children to avoid cursed places, to respect crossroads, to fear the howl of wolves as an omen. Though rooted in fear, these customs also offered a kind of care, a way of guarding those too small to guard themselves. In the minds of parents, superstition was another form of watchfulness. Thus, the world of childhood was shadowed by fears both holy and pagan. Superstition sought to explain what hunger, disease, and hardship could not, but its weight fell most often upon the weak. Children became symbols of misfortune, or vessels of unseen threat, shaped by the beliefs of their elders. It was a world where innocence was never secure, bound as tightly to fear as to love, and where survival meant enduring not only the harshness of life, but also the dread of the unseen. When famine gripped the land, the youngest felt its bite first. I remember the years of the Great Famine, from 1315 to 1317, when rains drowned the fields and crops rotted where they lay. Grain stores emptied, livestock perished, and hunger spread like a second plague. In such times, children's cries echoed in cottages, weak and fading as days passed without nourishment. Their small bodies bore hunger poorly, and many slipped away before reaching their 6th or 7th year. The harsh arithmetic of survival forced parents to make choices no heart should bear. Adults who could labor were given the scant bread, for they might still bring food tomorrow. Children, unable to work or defend themselves, were often left to hunger. Chroniclers recorded villages where only the grown survived. The little ones lost first to the cruelty of scarcity. It was not a lack of love, but the cold weight of necessity that decided who ate and who starved. Chroniclers wrote with sorrow of parents carrying lifeless children to shallow graves, their tears mingled with the rain. Entire households vanished in some regions, swallowed not by war, but by want. In towns, bread riots broke out, yet even stolen loaves could not fill every stomach. Infants often died within weeks, their mothers too malnourished to nurse them. The famine spared few, yet the children bore its sharpest edge. Noble households, though richer, were not immune. Crops failed in their lands as in all others, and even their tables grew sparse. Yet while their children faced thin meals, they seldom knew the hollow death of starvation. For peasants, by contrast, survival balanced on a knife's edge, and famine tipped it toward despair. The divide between privilege and poverty became painfully visible in the silent deaths of peasant children. The famine years also brought disease in their wake. Weakened by hunger, children fell prey to fevers and infections that would otherwise have been endured. Corpses lay unburied in some villages, for survivors lacked the strength to dig graves. The young, already fragile, became easy prey for illness. In their passing, they carried with them the future of their communities, leaving gaps that could not be filled for generations. Songs and laments arose from these sorrows, fragments of which have reached us still. Mothers sang of empty cradles. Fathers spoke in hushed voices of fields that betrayed them. Such laments were less poetry than testimony, bearing witness to the grief etched into entire regions. The famine years became a wound remembered long after the rain ceased, a mark carried by those who had survived their own childhood amid loss. Children who lived through famine did not escape unscarred. Stunted in body and weakened in spirit, they grew into adulthood, with the memory of gnawing hunger always present. Many spoke of food with reverence, never wasting a crumb, their lives shaped by the fear of hunger's return. A loaf of bread became more than sustenance. It was life itself, treasured above gold or silver. Famine carved its lessons deeply into those who endured. In this way, the famine years remind us of how fragile existence once was. Childhood could be extinguished not only by sword or sickness, but by the simple failure of the earth to yield its fruit. The fields betrayed, and the smallest suffered most. Hunger did not merely empty stomachs, it hollowed families, villages, and generations. In those years, childhood was not a promise, but a gamble, with death as the common victor. Even in a world pressed by hardship, children found moments to laugh, to chase, and to dream. Play was not absent, though it wore simpler clothes than the luxuries of later centuries. In village lanes, boys rolled hoops of wood or tossed balls made from stitched cloth, while girls shaped dolls from scraps of fabric or carved sticks. These games, humble though they were, allowed a brief escape from hunger and labor. For an hour, the burdens of survival seemed lighter. Archaeologists have unearthed small tokens of these joys, carved wooden horses, clay figurines, and little dice marked with careful strokes. Such objects remind us that even in poverty, families sought to give their children tokens of delight. These toys were often made by hand, crafted by parents or siblings in stolen moments. They carried not only amusement but affection, proof that love endured despite the weight of necessity. In their simplicity lies the echo of countless childhoods otherwise forgotten. Games often reflected the adult world, mirroring the roles children were destined to assume. Boys fenced with sticks, mimicking knights and squires they had seen, their shouts echoing the clash of steel. Girls played at keeping house, tending to smaller children or arranging imaginary feasts of leaves and stones. Through such play, they rehearsed the lives that awaited them, learning skills in the guise of laughter. Even joy was tied to preparation, for the world allowed no season of idleness. Communal festivals brought larger opportunities for play. On feast days, children joined races, wrestling contests, and games of blind man's bluff in fields or churchyards. These gatherings, rare as they were, filled hearts with excitement, binding the young together in laughter beneath the watchful eyes of elders. Such occasions lingered in memory long after, cherished as glimpses of joy amid otherwise stern lives. Play, in these moments, was not just amusement, but a fleeting form of freedom. Songs and rhymes, passed from mouth to mouth, were another form of childhood delight. Simple verses, chanted in rhythm, guided games of skipping or clapping. Their words, now half remembered, reveal the creativity of children who made music from their voices and rhythm from their hands. These chants did not require tools or wealth, only companionship. They stitched bonds between young hearts, reminding them that laughter needed no coin. Yet play was never free from the shadow of labor. A child might pause a game to run an errand, or end a race early to fetch water. Toys lay abandoned when chores demanded attention, and moments of joy were interrupted by the stern call of parents. Play was permitted, but always as a luxury, not a necessity. In this way, childhood amusement carried both sweetness and brevity, too easily swept aside by duty. In towns, street games mingled with danger. Children dodged carts while chasing balls, or slipped through market crowds in pursuit of one another. They played in alleys where refuse gathered, and laughter rang even amid filth and noise. Despite the hazards, the instinct to play proved stronger than fear, reminding us that even in the hardest conditions, joy found a way. Play flourished in places where nothing else seemed to grow. Thus, the memory of play in the Middle Ages is not one of abundance, but of resilience. Amid hunger, labor, and fear, children still carved spaces for laughter, however small. Their games were fragments of hope, glimpses of innocence clinging to lives otherwise burdened with survival. In their fleeting moments of joy, they revealed the indomitable spirit of youth, a light that refused to be extinguished, even in the darkest of times. Some children were given to God before they had even learned to speak. Families, moved by devotion or desperation, offered their sons and daughters to monasteries as oblates, binding them to a life of prayer and discipline. For peasants, it could be an act of survival, ensuring that one less mouth needed feeding at home. For nobles, it was often a means of securing influence in the church. Whatever the reason, the child's world shifted from the hearth to the cloister. Life within the monastery was ordered and severe. The young rose before dawn to the tolling of bells, joining chants in Latin they scarcely understood. Silence was the rule of the day, broken only by prayer or the intonation of scripture. Meals were plain and sparse, bread and broth consumed in silence as sacred texts were read aloud. In such surroundings, a child quickly shed the freedoms of youth, learning obedience as their most vital lesson. Education formed part of this existence, though it was steeped in faith. Children learned to read and write in Latin, copying psalms and passages from scripture. Their small hands grew steady holding quills, their minds shaped by repetition and devotion. Music too filled their days, for chanting was as essential as prayer. While literacy was a rare privilege outside the cloister, within it, children bore the responsibility of preserving sacred words, even if they longed for play beyond the walls. Discipline was ever present, for even the youngest were not spared correction. A lapse in silence, a stumble in recitation, or a hint of disobedience could earn swift rebuke. Punishments were framed as acts of guidance, meant to shape the soul toward holiness. Yet for a child, such correction often felt more like hardship than grace. Their laughter was stilled, their steps measured, their curiosity confined within cloistered stone. Innocence was trained into conformity. Girls in convents followed a similar path, their lives devoted to prayer, fasting, and work. They spun, sewed, and cared for gardens, all within walls they might never leave. Some entered willingly in later years, but those sent as children had little choice in their vocation. For them, the convent became both home and prison, shaping lives of devotion before they could choose devotion themselves. Their youth was exchanged for piety, whether cherished or resented. Despite the strictness, some found solace in this world. Monasteries offered safety from famine, shelter from war, and purpose in prayer. A child who might have starved in the village could live to adulthood within cloistered walls. Bonds formed among the young oblates, quiet friendships sustained by shared endurance. For a few, this life became a true calling, a place where devotion blossomed naturally, even if it had begun in compulsion. Yet many must have wondered at the life denied them. The laughter of village games, the warmth of family, the freedom of fields, all were absent from cloistered days. To grow in stone halls was to grow in restraint, shaping spirits into channels chosen by others. Childhood was curtailed, remolded into service of the divine, its natural curiosities often left unwatered. The cloister preserved souls, but at the cost of silencing youth. So it was that monasteries raised children into patterns of prayer and austerity, offering both survival and sacrifice. For those who lived within, the cloister was the world, a place where duty began in the cradle and never ended. Their lives remind us that childhood in those days could be consecrated before it was even lived, shaped by vows that bound not only the body, but the spirit. In every corner of medieval life, the Church's hand was present, guiding, instructing, and correcting. Childhood was no exception, for from baptism onward, the young were bound within its rituals and teachings. Priests reminded parents that children were born in sin, their innocence stained by the fall of Adam. It was the duty of both family and church to shape them toward salvation, often through methods that placed fear as close to faith. Childhood was lived beneath the shadow of holy authority. Festivals and holy days marked the rhythm of a child's year. They marched in processions, carried candles, or watched miracle plays that conveyed scripture through drama. These moments of pageantry dazzled young eyes, binding memory with devotion. Yet the joy of such occasions was balanced by the solemn weight of catechism, where children recited prayers and commandments until they became second nature. In this way, the Church taught through both wonder and stern repetition, binding faith to every stage of growth. Discipline was reinforced not only at home, but in schools tied to monasteries and cathedrals. Children were taught that disobedience was not merely against parents or masters, but against God Himself. The rod was used freely, justified as a tool to correct not just behavior but the soul. Fear of punishment in this life was tied to warnings of torment in the next, ensuring obedience through a blend of earthly pain and eternal caution. Few could escape the reach of this teaching. The Church also provided sacraments that marked the stages of youth. Baptism at birth, confirmation in adolescence, confession throughout. These rites framed a child's passage from cradle to adulthood. Each was infused with solemnity, reminding the young that their lives were part of a divine order. Such rituals carried comfort for families, yet they also bound children more tightly to structures beyond their choosing. Their lives were shaped not only by labor and hunger, but by doctrine. Stories of saints and martyrs were told to children as examples of virtue. Tales of Saint Agnes, who suffered martyrdom as a young girl, or Saint Nicholas, protector of children, offered models of endurance and faith. These figures set impossible standards of purity and sacrifice, urging the young to accept suffering with grace. To a child, such stories could inspire devotion, but they also carried the weight of expectation, reminding them that even youth was not free from the demand for holiness. Charity toward children was encouraged by the Church, though unevenly practiced. Foundling hospitals and orphan care often sprang from ecclesiastical roots, supported by alms and guild donations. Yet for each child aided, countless others remained beyond reach, left to fend for themselves. The Church's care, though genuine, could not match the scale of need. Still, its presence was often the only flicker of hope for those abandoned by family or fortune. The young absorbed lessons not only from sermons, but from the very spaces of worship. Stained glass, carved statues, and painted walls filled their eyes with images of heaven and hell, angels and demons. These visions were not mere art, but instruction, embedding moral truths in the hearts of those who could not yet read. A child standing in the nave of a cathedral stood also at the crossroads of fear and wonder, their imagination shaped by the Church's vision of the world. Thus, childhood in those centuries cannot be told apart from the influence of the Church. It offered faith, guidance, and ritual, but it also enforced obedience through discipline and fear. Children were nurtured and chastised, inspired and restrained, all within the embrace of holy authority. To live as a child, then, was to walk a path already marked by religion, where the first steps were guided by priests, and the last were always meant to lead toward God. From the moment of birth, children in my age lived beneath the shadow of death. Graveyards stood beside churches at the heart of every village, and children passed them daily, their eyes growing accustomed to rows of wooden crosses and stone markers. Funerals were common, so common that little ones often attended several before they reached their own 10th year. Death was not hidden away as in later centuries. It was part of the rhythm of life, a presence always near. The rituals of mourning surrounded children from their earliest days. They saw processions move through muddy streets, heard the tolling of bells, and smelled the incense rising over coffins borne on shoulders. The sight of neighbors wrapped in shrouds was ordinary, and even siblings were sometimes buried before memory could fully take root. In such a world, children learned early that life was fragile, and that tomorrow was never promised. Disease carried many away swiftly, but so too did accidents of daily life. Wells, fires, animals and tools all posed dangers to small hands and feet. Children witnessed the suddenness of these deaths, and their games often resumed in the shadow of freshly dug graves. They grew to understand that death was not an intruder, but a companion, walking alongside them even in moments of laughter. Mortality was not abstract. It was as close as the air they breathed. The Church framed death as a passage, teaching children that the soul's fate lay beyond this life. Priests spoke often of heaven, purgatory and hell, instilling both hope and fear. For the young, these teachings shaped how they understood the loss of friends or kin. They were told to pray for souls in purgatory, to believe their siblings or parents might be purified and lifted to heaven. Yet these assurances did not always quiet the ache of absence. Families mourned, but they also carried on, for grief could not halt the needs of survival. A child might help dig a grave for a sibling in the morning and tend goats in the afternoon. Such harsh continuity left its mark, teaching the young to harden themselves against sorrow. Yet tenderness persisted in small ways. Mothers preserving a lock of hair, fathers carving crosses with care. Love endured, even when death seemed to strip it away. Art and literature of the age reflected this closeness to mortality. Images of the danse macabre showed skeletons leading men, women, and children alike, reminding all that death spared none. Such depictions did not frighten so much as affirm what was already known, that life was brief and uncertain. For children, these images were mirrors of what they lived daily, symbols of a truth that no one could ignore. Even joy was coloured by this awareness. A feast day's laughter might be followed by mourning the next morning. A sibling's absence at table was a silence that could never be filled. Yet life pressed forward, demanding resilience from the smallest hearts. To be young in those centuries was to carry grief as naturally as bread or water, an ordinary weight that shaped character more than play or leisure ever could. Thus, death was never far from the child's world in the Middle Ages. It was teacher, shadow, and companion, a constant reminder of life's fragility. Children grew not in ignorance of mortality, but in intimacy with it, their outlook hardened, yet also deepened by loss. To survive into adulthood was to have walked a road lined with graves, each step a testament to endurance in a world where death stood always near. The Church held before children the examples of the young who had suffered for faith, saints whose purity was measured in their willingness to endure pain or death. Tales of Saint Agnes, martyred in Rome at the age of 12, were told to inspire obedience and devotion. Her refusal to renounce her faith was praised as the highest virtue, setting a standard that no ordinary child could hope to match. Yet such stories were repeated again and again, shaping how children were taught to see themselves. St. Nicholas, though remembered now for kindness and generosity, was venerated in those days as the patron of children. His miracles, saving youths from famine or slavery, were recounted in churches and homes alike. To hear of him was to be reminded that children, though vulnerable, were also under divine watch. Feast days in his honor often gathered the young in processions, offering rare joy in lives otherwise burdened with labor and fear. Such tales bound innocence to holiness in the imagination of the faithful. Other stories were darker, reminding children that suffering could be their calling. The legends of the holy innocents, slain under Herod, were commemorated as proof that even the smallest could serve God in death. Their feast day, observed with solemnity, placed before children the reminder that life might be short, yet still meaningful if endured in faith. Innocence became not protection, but offering, a lesson that pressed weight upon tender shoulders. For young listeners, these examples were both comfort and burden. They heard of saints who died bravely, yet they also learned that their own lives might be demanded in the same way. Faith was tied to endurance, even in the face of cruelty or violence. A child's natural fear was reshaped into a lesson of courage and piety, instilling ideals that blurred the line between devotion and resignation. Holiness was expected to be proven in suffering. Parents and priests alike used these stories as tools of instruction. They urged obedience, chastity, and steadfastness, pointing to saintly children as models to emulate. A boy who complained of hardship might be reminded of martyrs younger than himself. A girl reluctant to obey was told of virgins who defended their faith unto death. Such comparisons elevated the saints, but they also placed ordinary children beneath impossible expectations. Their daily struggles seemed small against such lofty examples. Pilgrimage sites and relics of child saints drew crowds, including families who brought their children to pray. To kneel before such shrines was to believe that the strength of holy youth could pass to the living. Parents prayed for protection, children whispered their own hopes or fears, and the presence of relics gave tangible form to faith. In this way, the memory of youthful martyrs continued to shape the lives of those still growing. The celebration of child saints also revealed society's view of youth as vessels of purity. Their deaths were idealized, transformed into symbols of innocence uncorrupted. Yet in glorifying their sacrifice, the Church overlooked the pain of ordinary children whose lives were consumed by hunger, labor, or abandonment. The stories shone brightly, but they cast long shadows over the reality of common childhoods, which seldom reached such sanctity. Thus, the memory of child martyrs and saints colored medieval childhood with both hope and pressure. They offered images of divine favor and protection, yet they also bound the young to ideals of suffering and sacrifice. Children were taught that holiness could demand everything, even life itself. In those tales, devotion and mortality walked hand in hand, leaving youth forever caught between reverence and burden. From the earliest years, children were guided into roles determined not by choice, but by gender. A boy was expected to carry tools, herd animals, or prepare for the weight of arms, while a girl was drawn toward hearth and cradle. These divisions were seen as natural, ordained by both tradition and scripture. To stray from them invited correction, for survival depended on each fulfilling what was believed to be their destined path. Childhood was molded swiftly into manhood or womanhood. Boys, whether of noble or humble birth, were groomed for labor and defense. In villages, they learned to till fields, handle plows, and care for livestock. In towns, they swept workshops, carried goods, and trained in crafts. For nobles, the course was sterner still, with martial training shaping them into squires and knights. They were told that their bodies belonged to toil and to war, their worth measured in strength and service. Their youth was a preparation for burdensome years to follow. Girls were set to household duties almost as soon as they could walk steadily. Mothers and older sisters taught them to spin wool, mend clothes, cook, and tend to younger siblings. Their training was steeped in patience and endurance, for their futures lay in marriage and motherhood. Domestic skill was considered as essential as virtue, and a girl's value was often judged by how well she managed these tasks. Thus, their play was often indistinguishable from preparation for adult life. Marriage shaped these expectations most of all. Girls were often betrothed in early adolescence, their lives directed toward becoming wives and mothers. Boys, though sometimes married young, were seen as providers, responsible for maintaining households and lineage. These roles reinforced the unequal weight carried by each gender, binding children to futures set before they could question them. Freedom of choice was scarce. Duty and expectation left little room for individuality. The Church strengthened these divisions, preaching distinct virtues for boys and girls. Boys were taught courage, obedience, and strength, while girls were reminded of modesty, chastity, and submission. Sermons reinforced that women were to obey, men to command, echoing the order believed to be set by God. These lessons were repeated in homes, schools, and even in play, until they formed the backbone of identity. Childhood was the crucible in which such roles were forged. Even in noble households, the pattern remained unbroken. A young lord was trained to manage estates and armies, while his sister was prepared to oversee servants, embroider tapestries, or bear heirs for alliances. Privilege softened surroundings, but did not dissolve expectations. A daughter of noble blood might be educated, but only so she could better fulfill her role as wife and mother. The weight of gender was as inescapable within castles as in cottages. For those who resisted or could not meet these expectations, life was unforgiving. A boy too weak for labor or combat was often shamed, while a girl unwilling to conform faced scorn or suspicion. Society left little space for divergence, pressing conformity with the full weight of custom. Children learned early that survival depended on acceptance of roles, not of their choosing. The road of life was paved before them, and deviation was seldom tolerated. Thus, The shaping of children by gender defined the very fabric of medieval existence. Boys and girls alike were pressed into molds of duty, their futures decided before their voices could be heard. Innocence did not shield them from expectation. Rather, it hastened their submission to it. In this order, childhood was less a time of discovery than of preparation, each step narrowing into paths carved by tradition, faith, and necessity. In the villages, where most of Europe's children were born, life followed the rhythm of the land. The seasons dictated everything: spring for planting, summer for tending, autumn for harvest, and winter for survival. Children grew within this cycle, their days marked by chores that mirrored the work of their elders. From the moment they could walk, they became part of the community's labor, learning not from books, but from fields, barns, and hearths. The soil itself was their first teacher. A child's world was small, yet demanding. They herded geese or sheep, carried water from streams, and gathered sticks for firewood. The youngest were sent to guard crops, clapping and shouting to frighten away birds. These tasks, though simple, carried weight, for mistakes could mean hunger for the whole household. Peasant children learned responsibility through necessity, and their worth was measured in the steadiness of their hands and the swiftness of their obedience. Childhood was less about freedom and more about usefulness. Homes were modest, built of wattle and daub, often with only one room for the family. Privacy was unknown, and children grew up in crowded spaces where parents, siblings, and even animals shared close quarters. Nights were spent on straw pallets, warmed by the breath of livestock. In such closeness, children absorbed the ways of adults quickly, listening to conversations of labor, struggle, and survival. Their education was one of constant observation, rather than formal instruction. Festivals provided rare relief from labor. On feast days, children joined processions, sang hymns, and watched plays performed in churchyards. These moments of joy broke the monotony of toil, filling their imaginations with color and story. Yet even here, the lessons of the village remained: discipline, faith, and obedience to custom. Play was fleeting, woven tightly into the fabric of ritual and duty. The village offered little space for idle delight. Illness and hunger were frequent visitors in these communities. Children bore the marks of malnutrition, their growth stunted, their bodies frail. Famine struck hardest at the smallest, for they lacked the reserves to endure. Death was no stranger in the village, and children grew up beside its presence, attending funerals as often as festivals. This constant closeness to hardship carved resilience into their spirits, but also robbed them of the carefree innocence that modern hearts associate with youth. Despite the harshness, village life was bound by strong communal ties. Children were watched not only by parents, but by neighbors, who corrected or praised them as if they were their own. Responsibility was shared, and the mistakes of one child could bring rebuke from an entire village. Such bonds gave security, but they also left little room for individuality. To grow in a peasant village was to belong to the whole, for better or worse. The church towered over village life, its bells marking time, and its priests shaping morals. Children attended Mass with their families, kneeling on stone floors and learning prayers by repetition. Saints' days and sacraments framed their lives, from baptism to confirmation. Faith offered comfort, but it also reinforced the harsh discipline of their upbringing. To stray from the church was unthinkable, and children absorbed this truth as deeply as they learned the rhythm of the plough. Thus, the childhood of peasants was a life of labor, community, and endurance. Their world was small yet heavy with expectation, a place where each day demanded effort and each season carried risk. Innocence was brief, overshadowed by work and hardship, yet even within this, bonds of family and faith provided strength. To be raised in the village was to be molded by the earth itself, hard, unyielding, but steadfast in its demands. Within castle walls, childhood unfolded under a different weight. Noble children were surrounded by stone, banners, and servants, yet their lives were bound by duty, no less than those in humble cottages. From birth, they carried the burden of lineage, their futures already plotted on the chessboard of politics. Every lesson, every gesture was shaped with an eye toward preserving honor and extending power. Their play was gilded, but their freedom was scarce. Boys born to noble blood were destined for arms or governance. At a tender age, they were entrusted to other households, serving as pages in great courts. There they learned not only martial skill, but the manners of nobility, how to bow, to serve at table, to speak with grace. Their toys were wooden swords and miniature armor, preparing them for the battlefield long before they could lift a true blade. Their laughter often rang in training yards rather than open fields. Girls, too, were shaped from the start for roles that served their families' ambitions. They learned embroidery, music, and the management of servants, preparing for lives as wives and mothers in arranged marriages. Tutors taught them to read prayers, sometimes even Latin, though their education rarely reached beyond what was deemed proper for their station. Their beauty, virtue, and obedience were counted as assets, tools in the forging of alliances that reached beyond the walls of their home. Feasts and ceremonies offered glimpses of splendor, but also reinforced responsibility. Children watched from high tables as their elders discussed alliances, disputes, and war. They were dressed finely, their presence symbolic of their family's legacy. Even in these moments of display, they bore the weight of expectation, their futures determined not by choice, but by lineage. To falter in grace or speech was to invite shame upon their name. The dangers of noble life were often hidden beneath its grandeur. Rivalries and power struggles placed children at risk, for heirs were valuable and vulnerable. Some were kidnapped for ransom, others poisoned in disputes of succession. A child born to a noble house carried both privilege and peril, their lives shaped by intrigues far beyond their understanding. Safety was never certain, even within thick castle walls. Education for noble children was more structured than for peasants, but it carried its own harshness. Boys studied Latin, law, and scripture alongside the arts of war. Girls were taught diplomacy through silence, grace through restraint, and faith through obedience. Tutors were strict, and mistakes were seldom forgiven lightly. The mind was trained as firmly as the body, leaving little room for curiosity outside sanctioned bounds. Despite the weight of duty, moments of affection did exist. Parents sometimes cherished their children deeply, though love was often tempered by political calculation. Chronicles recall kings mourning heirs, queens treasuring daughters, even as those same children were sent away to fulfill alliances. Within these contradictions lay the human heart of nobility, love entwined with ambition, tenderness sacrificed to duty. Such bonds were fragile, strained by the demands of power. Thus, the noble child lived between splendor and severity. Their youth was adorned with fine clothing and lofty halls, yet hemmed by duty, risk, and expectation. They bore privileges denied to the peasantry, but also burdens unique to their station, carrying the weight of entire lineages upon their shoulders. To be noble was not to be free, but to serve a destiny written before the first breath was drawn. The laws of our time offered little shelter for the young. Children were not seen as beings in need of special protection, but as smaller members of society bound to its rules. If a crime was committed against them, it was often judged less severely than if the victim were an adult. Their suffering carried less weight in the eyes of the court, for the value of a child's life was measured not by innocence, but by utility and inheritance. Legal codes across Europe reveal this stark truth. In England, a child under the age of 7 was considered incapable of crime, yet from that age onward, responsibility was assumed. Boys and girls barely past infancy could be punished for theft or mischief, sometimes with harshness equal to grown men. Elsewhere, corporal punishment was the norm, branding, whipping, or public shaming, used as tools of discipline sanctioned by law. Childhood offered no shield from justice's severity. Even in matters of inheritance, the law treated children with cold calculation. Orphans might lose claims to property if guardians failed to protect their rights. Illegitimate children were excluded from succession, regardless of circumstance. In noble families, disputes over succession often placed young heirs in peril, their lives contested by rivals eager for power. Legal systems that should have safeguarded them often turned instead into weapons wielded against them. For peasants, the law scarcely noticed children at all. A boy caught stealing bread in famine might face punishment, while the hunger that drove him went unacknowledged. Girls vulnerable to exploitation found little justice, for their voices carried little weight before courts dominated by men of power. Crimes committed against the poor often went unpunished, and children bore the brunt of this indifference. The law was not blind. It looked always to status before truth. The church played its own part in shaping legal views of youth. Canon law stressed obedience, reinforcing the idea that discipline, even harsh punishment, was essential for the salvation of the young. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes offered mercy, but they too demanded strict conformity. A child was considered a soul to be corrected, not a fragile being to be shielded. In this way, both civil and sacred law pressed heavily upon tender shoulders. In towns, guild statutes sometimes gave apprentices minor protections, limiting hours, or requiring masters to provide food and shelter. Yet these rules were often ignored, leaving children vulnerable to mistreatment. Enforcement depended on local will, and few dared challenge those with authority. For many apprentices, the law existed more on parchment than in practice. The gap between promise and reality was wide, and children paid the cost. Cases recorded by chroniclers show how justice often failed the young. Some children were executed for crimes, hanged or burned, though barely into their teens. Others were imprisoned in the same cells as hardened criminals, their innocence lost amid cruelty. Such records are grim reminders that medieval justice rarely distinguished between youth and adulthood. To stumble in law was to face punishments far beyond a child's strength to bear. Thus, the law of our time did little to soften the brutal edges of childhood. It bound children in responsibility before they had the means to understand, and it offered scant defense against harm. To be young was not to be sheltered by justice, but to be exposed to its indifference, subject to punishments as harsh as those faced by grown men and women. Childhood carried no privilege before the law, only the same weight of judgment without the same chance of mercy. The weakness of law and the turmoil of war left children vulnerable to theft as much as to hunger. Abduction was not rare, for a child could be ransomed, sold, or pressed into servitude. In borderlands plagued by raids, little ones were taken with livestock and goods, their cries fading into the clamor of conquest. Parents who searched often found no trace, for captors vanished swiftly into distant markets or hostile territories. The absence of a child became another silent wound upon the village. Ransom was a cruel but common practice. Sons and daughters of nobles, if seized, became pawns in negotiations, their release traded for gold or land. Chronicles tell of heirs carried off during feuds, their lives leveraged for the ambitions of rival lords. For peasants, such children held no ransom value, yet they too were taken, sold cheaply into labor, their identities erased. The same act that brought fortune to a captor when noble blood was involved brought only quiet tragedy when it was not. Markets across Europe and beyond absorbed these stolen lives. In towns, orphaned or abducted children could be passed into households as servants, their origins concealed by need. Farther afield, some were sold into slavery in distant lands, carried through trade routes that spanned from the Mediterranean into the East. The young, with their pliable strength, were easily absorbed into these systems, leaving behind only grief in the places they had once belonged. Kidnapping was not confined to foreign invaders or distant raiders. Neighbors, too, sometimes took part, stealing children from nearby villages in times of scarcity. Chronicles record disputes where families accused one another of taking a child to use as labor or sell into bondage. Suspicion grew in hard years, and the bonds of community frayed under the strain of survival. Trust was fragile when hunger pressed, and children often became the currency of desperation. The church condemned such acts, yet its voice did not silence them. Priests denounced child trade from pulpits, reminding all that souls could not be bought or sold. Yet enforcement was weak, and even monasteries sometimes took in children of questionable origin, content to justify their presence as charity. Words of faith could not fully resist the lure of profit or the pressure of need. Moral outrage often yielded to the silence of convenience. For noble families, the threat of abduction lingered constantly. Castles fortified their walls, and guards were stationed not only to repel armies, but to protect heirs. A child of lineage was both treasure and target, and parents bore the constant fear of loss. Betrothals and inheritances were jeopardized by such dangers, reminding all that even the highest station offered no immunity from peril. Safety was purchased only with vigilance, and even then, it was never assured. Those who survived abduction carried scars of displacement. Some were absorbed into foreign households, their languages, names, and faiths reshaped until their origins faded. Others returned after ransom or escape, but they were seldom unchanged, bearing memories of fear and exile that haunted them. Their stories seldom filled chronicles, yet their silence speaks loudly of the violence endured. The taking of a child was not merely theft of life, but theft of belonging. So it was that abduction and trade cast long shadows over medieval childhood. To be born was to face the risk of being taken, exchanged, or sold, your fate bound not by your own will, but by the hands of others. Childhood was fragile enough without such dangers, yet these acts reminded families daily of how little control they held. A child could vanish in a moment, leaving grief behind and carrying their innocence into the hands of strangers. To endure the first years of life was itself an achievement in the Middle Ages. Many never reached their 5th birthday, and those who did carried the memory of siblings lost along the way. By adolescence, survivors bore marks upon their bodies, crooked limbs from rickets, scars from disease, or weakened lungs from fevers that never fully left them. Childhood was not a stage of innocence, but a battlefield where endurance meant everything. To survive was to emerge already aged in spirit. The road to adulthood was lined with trials. Hunger gnawed in years of famine, and illness swept through villages in seasons of plague. Work left children weary before their bones were grown, and harsh discipline carved obedience into their hearts. By the time they reached 12 or 14, many were already hardened, their laughter dimmed by the weight of responsibility. Survival required not only strength of body, but also a will tempered by loss. Adolescence brought no respite, only heavier burdens. Boys entered apprenticeships or squired for nights, enduring long hours and strict correction. Girls were betrothed, expected to run households, or bear children before their youth had passed. Those who reached this stage had outlasted many dangers, yet new trials awaited them, no less demanding. Survival into adulthood was not an end to struggle, but the beginning of greater tests. Communities marked survival with quiet pride. Families who saw their children grow into teens gave thanks, for it meant the household had endured famine, disease, and misfortune. Villages watched as children stepped into roles once held by the dead, filling gaps left by lost generations. Every youth who matured was a reminder of resilience, living proof that even amid constant peril, life pressed forward. Their survival gave hope to those still cradling infants against uncertain futures. Yet the scars of childhood lingered. Survivors often carried chronic ailments, coughs that never ceased, twisted spines, or poor sight. Hardship left its toll not only on the body, but on the spirit. Many grew wary, cautious, mistrustful, their experiences shaping how they raised children of their own. Others embraced endurance as a badge, their strength forged in adversity. The struggles of childhood became lessons carried into the rest of their lives. For noble youths, survival meant preparing for the weight of inheritance. Their training hardened them for rule or war, but their lives, too, were fragile. Even heirs were lost to illness or accident, leaving dynasties shaken. To see a noble child grow to adulthood was to see the continuity of power secured, and families celebrated such milestones with feasts. For peasants, the survival of children meant simply another worker in the fields, another body to share the burden of labor. The church played its part in framing survival as divine mercy. Priests urged gratitude for every life preserved, reminding families that children who endured were blessings from God. Yet behind such words lay the truth of struggle. The parents who fought to feed them, the siblings who shared burdens, the children themselves who endured with quiet resilience. Survival was divine, but it was also human, won through toil and sacrifice. So it was that to reach adulthood in medieval times was no small thing. It meant enduring hunger, disease, labor, and sorrow, and carrying scars that would last a lifetime. Childhood was not a season to be enjoyed, but an ordeal to be survived. Those who reached maturity did so with hardened bodies and tested souls, their endurance shaping the course of their families and their world. Survival itself was the greatest victory of youth. In the art of our time, children rarely appeared as we might expect. Painters and sculptors rendered them not with the softness of youth, but as miniature adults, their faces solemn, their bodies proportioned like grown men and women. This was no failure of skill alone, but a reflection of belief. Children were seen not as beings with a separate stage of life, but as unfinished adults, waiting to take their place in labor or faith. Innocence was seldom the focus. Duty was. Illuminated manuscripts provide some of the clearest glimpses of how the young were portrayed. Margins show boys chasing birds, girls playing with dolls, yet even in these rare images, the gestures echo adult behavior. A child might hold a spindle, a toy sword, or a small book, signifying the roles that awaited them. These depictions remind us that play and work were bound together, inseparable in the medieval imagination. Art reflected not what childhood was, but what society expected it to become. Literature carried the same vision. Chronicles seldom mentioned children unless they were heirs, saints, or victims of tragedy. Stories praised obedience and piety, offering examples of young martyrs or precocious learners who embodied adult virtues. Folk tales, passed from mouth to mouth, often warned children of dangers, shaping their behavior through fear and caution. Rarely were they celebrated for their innocence. Rather, they were instruments for teaching or symbols of vulnerability. Even in religious imagery, the child was portrayed with weight beyond its years. The Christ child, painted in countless altarpieces, often bore the gaze of a man rather than the wonder of an infant. His small frame carried the solemnity of divinity, stripping away traces of fragility. Saints depicted as children, such as Nicholas or Agnes, were shown not in play but in devotion or suffering. Such images reinforced the expectation that childhood was a stage of preparation, not indulgence. For noble families, portraits of children served political ends. Painted likenesses of heirs were meant to display continuity of lineage, symbols of dynastic strength rather than tender keepsakes. A young prince might be depicted with sword or scepter, a girl with embroidery or prayer book. These representations were statements of duty, reminders to all that the child was bound to carry forward the will of the family. Their images were less about who they were and more about what they would become. In folk art and carvings, glimpses of ordinary children appear, though fleetingly. Simple woodcuts show games or seasonal festivals where the young joined in dances and songs. These moments reveal that even amid hardship, joy existed. Yet such depictions are rare compared to endless scenes of labor, faith, and discipline. The visual record of the age preserved what mattered most to adults, leaving the spontaneity of childhood largely invisible. Writers of moral texts address children directly, though always as learners of obedience. Manuals urged parents to correct faults swiftly, warning that unchecked behavior would lead to sin. Children were described as clay to be shaped, vessels for virtue or vice depending on their upbringing. Such words reveal not affection, but anxiety, a desire to mold the young before they could stray. Literature served as both instruction and warning, embedding lessons within stories and prayers. Thus, the cultural memory of children in the Middle Ages reflects more expectation than experience. Art, literature, and faith portrayed them not as carefree souls, but as figures already bound to adult roles. Their depictions remind us how society viewed youth, less a stage of discovery than a preparation for service, labor, or sacrifice. The image of childhood was never its own, but always a mirror of what adults required it to be. Looking back upon those centuries, the memory of childhood is one of endurance more than innocence. Life for the young was bound to labor, faith, and survival, their years shaped less by freedom than by necessity. Few were spared the burdens of hunger, disease, or discipline, and fewer still reached maturity without scars of body or soul. Childhood, as we now think of it, was almost unknown. What existed was a brief passage into the weight of adulthood. To survive was itself a triumph. The patterns of that age reveal much of how society valued its children. They were seen as future workers, heirs, or vessels of faith, their worth measured by what they could offer to family and community. Love surely existed, yet it was shadowed by the expectation that affection must never weaken discipline. Children were held tightly, but not gently. Their lives mirrored the harshness of the world, which demanded strength before tenderness. And yet, amid hardship, there was resilience. Play was not absent, nor was laughter, even if both were fleeting. A carved toy horse, a rhyme shouted in village streets, or a ball tossed between small hands spoke of the universal spark of joy that even hunger could not extinguish. The young found ways to endure, carrying fragments of hope within a world that seemed determined to strip it away. These moments remind us that humanity, however pressed, never fully yields. The church shaped their paths profoundly, offering ritual, guidance, and a framework of meaning. But it also bound them with fear, teaching that obedience was salvation and suffering a holy duty. Secular law, too, gave little defense, treating children as incomplete adults, subject to the same punishments and responsibilities. In both sacred and worldly orders, the young bore burdens disproportionate to their strength, and yet they bore them, for the world allowed no other course. Generations were marked by famine, plague, and war, and each left its mark upon the children who endured. The Great Famine hollowed them with hunger. The Black Death robbed them of families, and endless conflicts scattered them across fields and fortresses. They grew accustomed to graves and sermons of mortality, their imaginations shaped by shadows as much as by light. Childhood was never far from grief, but grief itself became a teacher of endurance. Still, those who survived carried forward the fabric of their world. They became peasants tilling soil, artisans shaping craft, knights bearing arms, and women raising families of their own. The strength carved into them as children became the backbone of medieval society, for every survivor represented a victory over unrelenting odds. What they learned in hardship they passed on, perpetuating cycles both of resilience and of severity. Their legacy was written in both endurance and sorrow. When we compare their lives to those of children now, the contrast is vast. Modern notions of childhood as a time of nurture, learning, and growth would have been scarcely imaginable then. And yet, without the endurance of those generations, the world that followed would not exist. Their survival, however brutal, became the soil from which later compassion and change would grow. We owe to their suffering a reminder of how far humanity has come. Thus, the legacy of medieval childhood is not one of tenderness, but of fragility, resilience, and endurance. It was a time when innocence was quickly consumed by hunger, labor, and duty, yet also when the spirit of survival proved unbreakable. Their lives whisper to us across the centuries, urging gratitude for the gentler worlds we now build for children. In their memory lies both warning and inspiration, carved deep into the long story of humankind.